Dear friends, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And today, as part of our series of lectures in our first chamber series, we're going to start our seminar in the Faculties of Medicine. This is going to be an 8-part series, and tonight we're going to speak a little bit about the Faculties of Medicine. And starting next week, we're going to start having good conversations on how is it that we work with the elementals, what are elementals indeed, and what are those dynamics of interaction that we are authorized to maintain. So we hope that this is going to be certainly a very useful seminar to you, just like every other of our seminars, and that you will certainly be able to bring a lot of happiness and a lot of joy, not only to yourself, but to your loved ones and those around you, as you may choose to partake, giving them a hand, eliminating and mitigating of their suffering. So, to start, we bring in a quote from Aureola Paracelso. Paracelsus is known as the father of medicine, and Paracelsus has stated in his Fundam Subfrangum, he says, the vanity of the erudite does not come from the heavens, but learn from one another, and upon this foundation they build their church. You see, as we walk into the space of having conversations about elemental therapy and working with elementals, we have to keep in perspective beyond the fact that we must open ourselves to that which is new. We have to also keep in mind that we will get out of this exactly what we bring into. If we walk into this topic with skepticism and with doubt, then evidently we will walk out taking exactly that with us. If we give ourselves the opportunity to open ourselves to that which is new, put these things into practice, observe the chains of causes and effects, then we put ourselves in a situation not only where we become more capable of learning, but we can create a very positive impact in our lives and in the lives of many others. Paracelsus speaks about the vanity of the erudite, and evidently that is not an attribute of the being. That is not an attribute of the consciousness, and that certainly has nothing to do with the true soul. All of this vanity comes from the comparisons of the mind, from sometimes real and sometimes made up triumphs. And as we compare each other, thinking that we may be better, that we may be more capable, or that we may know more, we start then creating this phenomena, this heresy of divisiveness. And as that happens, well, that divisiveness on its own brings with it plenty of suffering. What Paracelsus is telling us with these particular words is that before anything else, as we work with these superior forces of nature, that it becomes necessary for us to be humble, for us to be working in gratitude and in gratefulness for the opportunity to work with these elemental forces of nature. Because all of these forces have one goal present, and that is to help humanity and to partake with the works of man. Dr. Hahn, back from Yale University in the year 1934, he was quoted by saying, "I'm courageous enough to publicly declare myself a partaker of astrology. The time has come for us to recognize astrology as a science, and I regret not caring about astrology earlier." Now, these are the words of a doctor. They certainly are the words of a man who dedicated much of his life into studying the science of man. But today, just the mere notion of astrology, anything that carries an essence of spirituality and mysticism, it is very common to see people rolling their eyes, walking away, pretty much immediately disconnecting themselves from the subject. And we do not say that as a means of judging or criticizing. We can certainly understand why that happens. The fact is, is that we have been fooled before many times. Many times we have been offered keys and solutions to our problems. We have been offered magical remedies for our afflictions and our sadness. And as we have tried them, as we have invested ourselves into them, whether it is invested in time and effort and sacrifice, perhaps even invested money, we have ended up walking out empty handed. So we do not judge people for the way that they may immediately react to, once again, these concepts of astrology and mysticism, spirituality. Nevertheless, that does not mean that those forces do not exist. As we observe the stars, it is not the physical star what has a direct influence on us, even though we should say that all of these celestial bodies emit radiations. Just as all of these celestial bodies, they have their own massive electromagnetic fields that have an effect on our psyche and in our personality. But the core influence from the stars, it comes from the archetypes of the stars themselves. And those archetypes are powerful souls. They are developed masters in degrees of mastery that exist beyond what our mind is even capable of comprehending. But we do not have to just focus our attention in the constellations of the zodiac, or even try to think what is the soul, the archetype, that ruling intelligence behind the galaxy, a cluster of galaxies. We don't have to think about that. All we have to do is look at the influences of the 7 planets of alchemy that exist within our very own solar system. And by now, as you already know, these are Mercury and Venus. These are Mars, the Sun, the Moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. And each one of these 7 has its individual and particular soul. And you would remember that the soul of the planet Mercury is Archangel Raphael, the wisdom of God. You will remember that the soul of planet Venus is Archangel Uriel, the love of God. You would remember that the soul of the moon is Archangel Gabriel, the hero of God. That of the sun is Archangel Michael, whom like God. The one of Mars is Archangel Samael, which is the law of God. And of Jupiter is Archangel Zachariel. And Zachariel, the translation of his name is a little bit more complex. But if we were going to be brutally literal, it means the great man who guards the well of the wisdom of God. And then there is Archangel Orifiel, the archetype of the planet Saturn. And that is our own Ancient of Days. That is the Chronos of the ancient Greeks. Each one of these souls has a very definitive and tangible influence over our psyche, over our personality, to the degree that the 7 days of the week are aligned specifically with each one of these 7 planets. And you remember this from your pre-chamber, because the day of Saturn is of course Saturday, and the day of Sun is Sunday, and the day of the Moon is Monday, and the day of Mars is Tuesday, that in Spanish is Martes. The same with Wednesday, which is Mercredi, the day of Mercury, and of Jupiter, Jovis Pater, which is Jueves, Thursday, and of Venus, well then Viernes, which is Friday. So you can see the 7 days of the week are aligned with the influences of each one of these great masters, these cosmo creators, these great archangels of creation. So when we seek to see these celestial bodies as a primordial intelligence, then understanding their influence becomes clearer. And here, Dr. Hahn clearly states, I regret not caring about astrology earlier. Again, astrology has nothing to do from a Gnostic perspective with the astrology that we would find at the state fair, with the astrology that we would find on a website where there is just an algorithm running random variables in the background generating information every time that you give a click. It is not that. Here, we are working directly with those superior forces of nature. And astrology and medicine, they are intimately related. When it comes to the topic of astrology, this is wisdom that reaches us today from the very first eons of humanity. Back in those days when on the face of the earth roamed the people of the polar race, well, they were in a spiritual condition, in a level of being that was so superior compared to ours, that it was easy for them to have these conversations face to face with all of these primordial forces. But as the eons have come and gone, and as we continue to degenerate ourselves, the farther away we set from the ability of being able to perceive them. And what we know today about astrology is nothing but a mere fraction of the profound wisdom that all those ancient great masters knew. So suffice it to say that all of this wisdom comes to us as a legacy from all of the previous civilizations, all those that preceded us. And astrology itself is the foundation of all of the ancient schools of medicine. And this is important because depending on the day of the week, you can work and make use of those forces to work with plants that are associated to those particular forces and thus magnify the effect of the work with those particular elementals. Look, the Arahuaco Indians of the Sierra of Santa Marta in Colombia, for them, those who are selected to learn of these topics, both the topics of astrology and medicine are both part of the same complicated organism. These topics complement each other to such a degree that as they develop their wisdom working with the forces of nature, they are tested both on the influences from the stars and the forces and the capabilities of the plants. The Arawak Indians, they receive all a very similar education to that which is given to the Tibetan Lamas. In the case of the Arawak Indians, at the age of 7 years old, those who are selected are taken away from the nucleus of their family and they are dedicated so that they can invest 13 years of their life in these particular studies. And in the way that they used to do it, they used to gather these children and they will isolate them from the rest of the group, and they would have the child reside in a very particular location where he would be receiving no external influences, but only have them focus on the internal work that is necessary so that they could see, so that they could hear. And when we see this, it's seeing beyond the aspect of the thing itself to see the essence of the thing. You see, they are not looking at the appearance of things, but things themselves. And when it comes to hearing, they are developing the ability to hear not only the voice of the innermost and the voice of the consciousness, but to be able to receive that wisdom that comes from all of these elementals and all of these elemental forces of nature. They are also isolated so that they can work on the development of superior faculties that allow them the highest way of thinking, which is not thinking, bypassing the comparisons of the intellect into ways in which they can rely in inspiration and intuition, meaning in the ability to know the significance of things without reasoning, and the ability to know the reason for things themselves without engaging in the comparative process of the mind. In this isolation, Samael tells us these children, as they grow and are being developed, they are being fed in through one window and they are receiving wisdom through another. Now, of course, these are all great masters. And we know that the lives of the masters, they are lived in symbols. This is speaking about the ability to receive that wisdom directly through the windows of the soul. Their education, as they start developing themselves, is received from the most junior lamas. Because as they are developing themselves, they know that they are all an integral part of that community, of that organism. So the most junior, they are available to teach the new things that they have learned. And then, as that new student is making progression, he eventually ends up receiving the final teachings directly from the lips of the great masters. And they learn about the study of plants. They learn about the occult powers of plants. And they learn about elementals. And this is why this seminar is called Elemental Therapy. How is it that we can provide healing working and interacting with elementals? But you heard us say earlier that they develop the ability to see beyond the appearance of things. That faculty is the faculty of clairvoyance. But in days like today, we have become too fanatic. We carry too many fixed ideas with these ideas of clairvoyance. And we think that what's going to happen is that one day we're going to be able to find somebody with a tuning fork, and they're going to make the fork vibrate and put it in our head, and before long we're going to open our eyes. We're going to be able to see invisible people who are roaming around us, and now nothing is going to be hidden. You see, this is the kind of things that we think we would like to see in our lack of patience. All of these faculties just emerging overnight. That's not the way that it works. When it comes to the faculty of clairvoyance, clairvoyance is the same thing as objective imagination. And Samael is very clear when he tells us everybody is more or less clairvoyant, as everybody is more or less imaginative. So the faculty of clairvoyance exists within you to some degree today. And that degree may be different from the next person and the other person, but it does not matter. What is important is that we acknowledge that and that we work on developing it. And in our practices and the doctrine of Gnosis that Samael has unveiled for us, he has given us plenty of practices for us to awaken the faculty of clairvoyance. But we have to be diligent. We have to be a little bit more tenacious. Because there are some of us who have been in these studies for 5 or 10 years, and we received those very same practices 8 or 10 years ago, and we have never used it. So how do we expect to change? You see, there has to be deliberate effort. There has to be the application of willpower for those things that essentially build the consciousness. And you would remember that he taught us the mantra E. He taught us the practice with a glass of water, adding a little bit of azogi or liquid mercury into the water and just dropping a mirror in the water so that we can learn to see the colors of the astral light. He taught us that practice of visualizing the birth, growth, and death of a rose. And he gave us many others, but we need to put them to use. And just for perspective, the Arawak Indians, the way that they work in the development of clairvoyance is that they would stand with one staff on their hand. And that staff is very meaningful because that is a symbol of the staff of wisdom. That staff of wisdom is also a symbol of the spine. Spine with all of its awakened powers. And what they will do is that at night, they will stand still holding on to that staff. And they will contemplate the heavens. They will focus all of their attention to a star on the heavens. and knowing that there is a dynamic transaction of energy, there is an energy flux that exists between our planet and that star, and that we are intermediaries because our physicality is there to receive those cosmic vibrations and transform them and deliver them to the interior layers of the earth, just like we receive energy from the earth through our feet and digest it through our body and return it out to the infinite heavens. As they contemplate the star and as they make themselves conscious of being part of that energetic flux, they start becoming capable of remote viewing. And they can see at that distance without the need of being there. Friends, the topic of remote viewing is not a new thing. This is not a subject of fantasy. Remote viewing has been practiced in the United States and in other countries like China and Russia for 50, 60, 70 years. And it had been practiced by some governments because remote viewing is the same as sensing with the mind. And there have been many successful experiments where people have been deliberately being worked to develop these faculties so that they could see something that may be happening at the other side of the world. Now the flaw is that our governments decided to make use of these superior faculties for the sake of spying, of meddling around, of finding out things. You see, trying to always get that little advantage over the other. And because of that, well, many of these initiatives, well, they were eventually closed and they were filed away. But remote viewing is nothing new. This is something that we have known for the better part of 50 or 60 years. And today, well, there are many people who are capable of putting to use their faculty of objective imagination. In the development of clairvoyance, the Indians of Bolivar in Colombia, they would work directly with the elemental of the guasimo tree. And what they would do is that they would sit exactly at 6 p.m. under the shade of a guasimo tree, an olive tree, or a totumo tree. And they will place a bottle of rum, a clock, a candle, and a dinner plate right there with them. And they will consume their meal while attentively looking at another tree that may be immediately across from them. And as they do this, well, they make use of all of these other substances so that they can stimulate a superior manifestation of the consciousness. We could perhaps say an altered level of consciousness. And as they are doing this, they do this constantly reciting the Christian creed. See, I believe in God Almighty, etc., etc. And they will do this to allow the mind to focus only in those things that are truly edifying. To not allow the mind to be distracted in daydreaming or in fantasies or in their problems or in their challenges or in any of the other things that could be distracting them at the moment. And when they make use of some of these substances to stimulate and achieve an altered state of consciousness, well, they can do such things because they are operating at levels of being that are superior to ours. You know, we cannot use this as an example and say, whoa, I have heard that some people use peyote to be able to achieve experiences in the astral plane. So if the Indians of Bolivar are doing this, in Gnosis, they told me that I can do this as well. So please don't think that, because we are not even suggesting that. When we start relying on those psychedelic substances, when we start relying on all of those stimulants, we start creating psychological dependencies. And because we are unconscious now in the visual state, and because we are unconscious within the dream state as well, the moment that we experience those altered states of consciousness, we also do that. in the very same state of the sleep of consciousness. And as we repeat the exercise, we end up creating psychological dependencies. And we have seen this before, where some students just suffer the unmentionable because they experienced it once, and without it they have not been able to experience anything. And then they think that they need that. And that is not true. So these Indians of Bolivar and Colombia, they would work on the days of Thursdays and Fridays. Now, it is not the Thursday of our calendar. It is not the Friday of our calendar either. It is the true cosmic Thursday and the true cosmic Friday. And you would remember from our pre-chamber that cosmic day Friday is our current day Tuesday, and that the cosmic day Thursday is our current day Friday. So they work at those specific times and on those specific days so that they can receive the influences of Archangel Uriel and Archangel Zachariel. And this is how they work on developing their faculties of clairvoyance. Now, as we look at applying the teachings of this sacred medicine, we must know a little bit more about the human anatomy. And by now, those of you who are at this level of study, you have seen much of this information many times before. And those of you who are seeing this for the first time, allow us to tell you that our human anatomy, it is septuplet in its constitution. That means that it is made of 7 distinct parts. And these 7 parts that make up our human anatomy, they are not the 7 chakras. We're speaking about 7 distinct bodies that make up the true human being. And in this septuplet constitution, the first one, and of course the most tangible one for us, is the limbus. That is the physical body. That physical body is that aggregation of bones and tissues and flesh and all those organs and bloods and liquids and hormones and everything else that is flowing through your organism right now. And notice that the limbus also has, as a microcosmos, its own individual set of particular intelligences. And you know this because while you're listening to this lecture, your liver is still working and you're not even having to think about it. Just like your heart continues to beat at a specific rhythm and you're not even commanding it to do so. Just like your endocrine system is receiving neurotransmitters, hormones that come as a result of neurotransmitters, and it's also discharging hormones at specific concentrations into your bloodstream, and you don't even have to think about that. So there is an intrinsic intelligence that governs your physical body. But the physical body by itself is not all. For it to be alive, there has to be something that infuses life into it, and that is the mumia. The mumia is the ethereal body. It is also known as the vital body. And this ethereal body is made up of 4 distinct ethers. The chemical ether, responsible for all of the functions related with our metabolism. Then there is the biological ether, the one responsible for all of the functions of our reproductive system. And 2 superior ethers, the reflective ether and the luminous ether. These are the ones associated with our cognitive abilities and our abilities to perceive and think. While the ethereal body permeates the vital body can remain alive. And when you remove aspects or pieces of that ethereal body out of your body, you can immediately see that your physical body dies, meaning it loses all of the senses. And of course you know this because every time that you have been sleeping over your arm and you interrupt the flow of blood and thus interrupt the flow of prana into your arm goes numb to the degree that doesn't feel anything. You can think as hard as you want, but it will not move. And the same thing happens to your legs. So this is the vital body. Beyond that, there is the archaeos. This is the astral body. And today, what we have is an astral body that is of a lunar nature. When you see it, it is ghost-like. And what we're seeking is to develop a superior solar astral body that can allow us the opportunity to be immortal within that fifth dimension of nature. Beyond the archaeos is the sidereal body. This is the mental body. And beyond the mental body, there is the adek. That is the body of Adam. That is the causal body. That body exists within the sixth dimension of nature, in that sphere of the tree of life where the human soul of our innermost resides. Then there is the Alwek, and the Alwek is the body of the illuminated soul. This is the Burek body. And last is body number 7, which is the body of Atman, the body of the innermost. So this is exactly why we need to develop our faculty of clairvoyance, so that we can see these bodies. And of course, there are other good reasons why we need the faculty of clairvoyance, just as we need the faculty of moving consciously in our astral body. So, as we can see, we can then perceive the different subtle bodies that make up the true man. 7 subtle bodies. And each one of them has influence, and each one of them acts over the endogenous glands, and these are all responsible for releasing hormones into the body. Dr. Kirsch, he says, smell, sight, hearing, etc. show their functionality as variations in electromagnetic oscillations. And George Lakhovsky, he says, everything irradiates and everything is energy. So the fact that these bodies exist but you don't see them does not mean that they are a figment of our imagination. These bodies are also made of flesh and blood. It is just that they are made of a flesh and a blood that is different from the matter that is meant to exist within this third dimension of nature. Very well. So we know that the internal bodies of man are of an energetic nature. And Paracelsus tells us there are 2 species of flesh. There is the flesh of Adam, the physical body, that is the terrestrial flesh. And then there is the flesh not derived of Adam, that one which is subtle and can penetrate walls without the need of doors and windows. However, both species have their own blood, bones, and both differ from the spirit. And there have been many great masters who have walked the face of the earth, and they have been able to dominate and influence this flesh that is not derived off the flesh of Adam. And a good example of that is St. Francis of Assisi, a man who would fall into a deep state of meditation in his own prayers. And as he would do that, he would achieve a state of samadhi, an internal ecstasy that will give him the opportunity to walk with his physical body into the 4th dimension of nature and levitate. And his helper, as he brought him lunch, he would get very frustrated with him because he would bring him lunch and he would have to wait for St. Francis to just be done with a state of ecstasy so that he would come down and eat. You see? But today, ever since the 18th century, Samael tells us, back in the 18th century is when this humanity started becoming truly materialistic. And we took a turn. It was an inflection point of humanity, but it was an inflection point towards materialism. towards the worsening of our overall human condition. And Master Samael, he tells us to know of the official chemistry without knowing about occult chemistry is useless. It is absurd to study medicine without developing the faculty of positive clairvoyance, which will allow us to perceive the 7 bodies of man. Those of you who may be interested, there is a very interesting book. By now, this book could be 70, 80 years old, and it is called Occult Chemistry. And the author of that book is Charles Leadbeater. If it's of your interest, look for it. Read it. Reflect on it. So that you can learn from him, Annie Besant, and the others who worked to create the book, on all of these subtle structures of chemicals and elements, and you will gain a deeper understanding on the words of Samael. Upon the completion of studies, the Arawak Indians are all examined by their teachers, and they do this before a presiding council of Indians of the Sierra of Santa Marta. Each one of the teachers or professors, they will examine the student with their own bag of plants, and they will do this methodically, one plant at a time. And the student has to be able to not only identify them by type, by kind, by name, but also speak of their occult powers, their faculties, and their uses. And as that is done, those who educate them in astrology will examine the relevant topics in astrology. The Magi examine their development then in practical magic. And this is a very common practice, because even the Tibetan lamas, they examine their students in Osmotherapy, which is the healing with perfumes. And we all know about the efficacy of healing with perfumes. The thing is that today, well, we just decide to make use of our essential oils, and we will have our vaporizers in the home, and we do it more for the smell and the calmness, not necessarily knowing about the healing powers that exist in many of those essential oils. But allow us to tell you this, because we must give always a word of caution everywhere where danger lurks. Many of the essential oils that you will find today, in order to be made available in volume and cheap, they are not truly natural. They are synthetic oils that can mimic the aroma of the true essential oil. So before you decide to go and get new essential oils and start setting vaporizers in the house, go through the extra effort of trying to find and source them from places that you can actually tell that they are selling you the right thing. We don't want you to be enjoying of the aroma and, on the other hand, well, then be bringing in chemicals that may affect you adversely a little bit later. In this topic of osmotherapy, Rudolf Steiner says healing with perfumes is a wisdom that comes to us from a remote past, and such healing has a splendid future. And indeed, it has, because it is still very prevalent today. And you would remember from our pre-chamber, how is it that we spoke about osmotherapy back in our lecture on the demon alcohol and the effects of alcohol, so that you can help your loved ones overcome and defeat the vice of alcohol. Charles Leadbeater, he says our vices and sins have consequences in our vital body, and such larvae can be eliminated via the action of certain perfumes. So depending on our actions and our thoughts, we will give way and create focal points of growth to different types of larvae that would nourish themselves out of our own vitality. And this is true for all those larvae that are growing because of the vice of masturbation. All those larvae that are associated to our fears and our desires. And the one thing that we can do is that we can use perfumes like belladonna, perfumes like perhaps working with the elemental of sage saffron, sulfur. And we can work with those to destroy these larvae, to release them from our vital body so that we can regain that vitality back. Because everything that happens to the vital body has an inevitable effect in our physicality. Shimapuma is the name of some wraps with aromatic herbs that some Tibetans hang from their temples for the sake of healing, for the sake of improving the quality of the environment, for the sake of destroying the larvae that many people bring into the temples without them even knowing that that's what they're doing. And last, here we have the Sanctuaries of Medicine. Oriental yogis in subterranean cities in the Amazon are custodians of sacred treasures of Atlantis. And in the wilderness of California, there is a mysterious city that exists in Jinn state and is populated with survivors from the lands of Lemuria. And they are custodians of ancient medical wisdom. And you are invited to present yourself before any one of these sanctuaries of medicine. All that you need to do is continue working actively so that you can unfold consciously in your astral body. And in lieu of that, you can always ask of your innermost to take you to one of these sanctuaries of medicine so that these great masters can help you. One of the greatest sanctuaries of medicine is the Temple of Alden. And this is the temple of universal medicine. This is where Archangel Raphael, Paracelsus, Galeno, Hermes Trismegistus officiate. And when you present yourself there in your astral body, as you knock on the door of the temple and you do the necessary salutations before you can walk in, as you take those sacred steps towards the inside of the temple and you prostrate before these great masters and implore them for their help, when they help you, the first thing that they do is that they sit you in one of their chambers and they irradiate your astral body with special lights. Lights of color blue and yellow and red. And they do this to destroy those larvae that are attached to your subtle bodies. And they do that to start providing healing, to start giving you an opportunity to improve your condition so that you can make better use of your energies, and rather than squander them, that you can apply them to your own internal and spiritual work. We're very grateful to all of these sources out of which we were able to get these images, to put this material together and offer it to you tonight. So dear friends, this has been the very first of a series of 8 lectures in the topics of elemental therapy. Tonight we have covered the faculties of medicine. Thank you so much, dear friends, for being with us this evening, and may all beings be happy.